Richard Syrett'S Strange Planet. Following the truth wherever it leads. Exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites. Revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs. Here's Richard.
And welcome once again to another edition of Strange Planet. Thank you, as always, for sticking me in your ear. And we're going to combine a couple of my favorite topics on this episode. One is rock and roll. I love to talk rock and roll. I love classic rock. And we're going to combine that with conspiracies. And the world of rock is not immune to conspiracies, as we're about to find out with Josh Reeves, Dallas, Texas-based researcher, filmmaker, radio talk show host, who, like many of us who toil in this field of conspiracy and the unexplained, first learned of government crimes in the 1990s by reading Jim Marr's Crossfire, which led him to start investigating black operations and secret societies. He's got a terrific YouTube channel. We'll tell you how you can watch, as well as his film Lost Secrets of Ancient America. That's a trilogy. We'll tell you how you can see that as well. But we're going to focus on another trilogy, another series of films called The Spellcasters. Last time Josh was here, we talked about the death, murder perhaps, of Kurt Cobain. And today we're going to focus on, well, we're going to start really around the Cold War era and take it all the way up into, I guess, a period of rock and roll like Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne and much more. Josh, welcome once again. How are you?
Hey, I'm great, Richard. Thanks for having me back again.
If you were to describe the Spellcasters series, volumes 1, 2, and 3, I just kind of gave it a bit of a tease, but how would you explain what it's all about, what you're trying to explore in this series of films?
It's an exploration into the machinations of mind control and psychological operations within the entertainment industry, both in Hollywood and in the music industry, which is more of what I cover in Volume 2 and Volume 3. Volume 1 was more of an exploration into Hollywood and that whole thing, and definitely ties in with all the other stuff. But just as you mentioned of yourself, Richard, being a big fan of music and all of that, I would never have been able to make these films if I hadn't been paying attention to this stuff already all these years, to notice weird anomalous things that came back to me once I started doing research into these topics. So it's really a lifelong thing. I mean, this film series took forever to make. I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to get it done. And there's so much information that it's almost impossible to get it all in there. And so I try to just condense these films down to what I felt like was the stuff I wanted to cover the most. But I hope at some point I'll be able to make a Spellcasters addendum film, which will be more music conspiracies and stuff that didn't really fit and tie into these three films initially.
Well, you certainly connect a lot of dots in Volume 3 of The Spellcasters. I learned a lot. And it kind of starts in an unusual place. Tell us about Porton Down, which is in Wiltshire, England, which is kind of in the northeast of England. Porton Down, this science park. Tell us about it, what that all has to do with Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath and all the rest.
Yeah, it's really wild. Well, the thing is, Richard, as you well know, that whenever stuff like MK Ultra and that kind of thing, even stuff going back to World War II with Operation Paperclip and stuff, all that stuff, it really tends to lean more towards the American end of things because those projects were American-known projects. But what a lot of people don't know is that Great Britain actually had its own version of Project Paperclip, where they brought over former Nazi scientists and guys to work in their fields and stuff too. So that's one thing that is very important, especially with what this film sets up, because originally this was supposed to be one film. Volume 2 and Volume 3 were supposed to be one film. That's why it's very important for people out there. I saw last time I was on, Richard, some people were skipping Volume 2 and going right to Volume 3 and not even watching Volume 2. And that's really a mistake because they're supposed to be one film put together for a reason, but I had to split them up because there was so much evidence, so much information. But Porton Down is a place that came on my radar because I had heard of these LSD experiments, which are well documented, that they were doing there, because it was in the news. Gosh, I guess probably around the time I first started my radio show back in 2007, 2008. It was in the news a lot then, because a lot of these families and a lot of the victims that were experimented on with LSD by Porton Down, which is a science research facility, purports to be, but in England. But they've done all sorts of military control experiments there through the years. There's been all kinds of stuff that's come out of there, but they documented. There's a lot of stuff that's come out that isn't necessarily provable and documented. I mean, wild stuff. You wouldn't believe the stuff that's out there about Porton Down, stuff like human alien hybridization programs and stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff. And, who knows if that stuff's true or not, but just judging off the stuff that we know is true about Porton Down, that they actually experimented on humans and used humans as guinea pigs in these mind control experiments with psychedelic drugs. They tested them on soldiers. It's documented. There's footage in the film. In the film, there's footage of actual stuff that they documented of these soldiers out just tripping in the woods and just to see what happens. I mean, and they're trying to get these soldiers to try and do actual military activities while they're under the influence of this stuff. It's just wild they did this. But the one thing that I was leading to with all this is that stuff like mind control and MK Ultra and the rest of it within the music business is not relegated just to the United States. And in fact, the United States and British intelligence, MI6 and the British government were working in tandem with the Tavistock Institute as well, with the United States, with the American CIA on these programs. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of people just think, oh, well, it's just American. But you know what else? Actually, this is going to be in the Spellcasters Addendum. I'll actually drop something here on this show that's an exclusive I haven't even talked about yet. And I'll do this because for you, Richard, and for your Canadian listeners, actually, a lot of people may or may not know this, but actually Canada had its own MK Ultra as well. That was an offshoot of the American and British version. And I hope to document that in a later film. Right. But
maybe referring to McGill University and Allen Memorial Hospital in Montreal during the Cold War. And it was done with the complicity and the sanction by the Canadian government. Was it Dr. Ewan Cameron?
Yeah, absolutely. God, I love talking to you, Richard. You know all this stuff. It's great.
Yeah, but I don't want to get off on a tangent, but we'll save that for our next show.
No, I just wanted to mention that because some of your Canadian listeners may or may not know that. You know it, and it's great because you're informed, but it's just great to talk to somebody. I don't get that chance very often that actually knows what they're talking about when it comes to stuff. And you do, sir. You do. So I tip my hat to you. But Porton Down is so interesting because of the human experimentation and stuff they've done there. They were also testing stuff on the population of Northern England, and where they were testing a lot of this stuff at. They were doing like nerve gas tests and all kinds of crazy stuff on just regular civilians, specifically in the northern part of England. And what's interesting about that is that northern part of England, as you know, Richard, I don't have to tell you, is where so many of the greatest bands of all time.
Liverpool,
ever.
Manchester, Birmingham, the Mercy Beat. Yeah.
An insane amount of the greatest artists of all time just happened to come out of this area in northern England where they were producing all of these experiments and all making people into guinea pigs, testing these drugs on them. So that's one of the things that I wanted to serve as a dichotomy to the other stuff that I'd already presented is that, hey, man, look, this stuff was not just going on in the United States. I mean, there's a reason why this explosion of music and this explosion of culture just happened to come out of that place in England when it did, in the big way that it did. It was no mistake or accident or chance. This stuff was all calculated. And it was really, Tavistock, the name of Tavistock, the Institute of Human Studies. I mean, it's all social engineering. And so they want to see what they can get people to take. And I really do think that the stuff that happened with Porton Down and what they were doing in the 1960s and whatnot, and all this MK Ultra stuff, as crazy as it sounds, and I believe it, I know people, it sounds crazy and wild, but I really think that kind of stuff is what led to what they've done recently with us, with COVID, with the pandemic, with the fear mongering, with getting to see what we would accept, what people will accept, and what they will do, and where their line is. I believe that was all leading up to this. And what's interesting is that Fortin Down, which still is in operation today, is one of the few, only a handful of laboratories that actually had COVID on hand prior to the pandemic. They had it in their laboratories, and nobody really, for the most part, that I've seen has even considered Fortin Down could be a part of the lab leak, because they're trying to really push everything and assign blame on everything to China. And look, maybe, I don't know, maybe China is to blame. But the thing of it is, we know for sure that Fortin Down has experimented on the public before. We know they have let things out of the lab at nerve gas, LSD, all of this stuff on the unsuspecting public. We know they had COVID prior to the pandemic in their laboratories. It's at least worth considering that possibly Fortin Down is still up to their old tricks today.
So these experiments, we mentioned this area of England, Manchester, Birmingham. You had, let's name some of the, I mean, obviously we know the Beatles from Liverpool, but some of the other bands that were coming out of Manchester and independent or solo artists as well. Manchester, Birmingham. You want to go down sort of the laundry list of rock and roll greats?
Oh my God, I didn't even think of it. Well, let's start with Birmingham first. I mean, Birmingham, you had Black Sabbath, you had Judas Priest. Well, I mean, that's the founders of heavy metal. I mean, those guys were hearing the factories while they were in school. They were hearing the sounds of metal banging against metal in these factories, and it just inspired them to do it. But I mean, in Birmingham alone, you had Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, ELO. You had some of the members of Fleetwood Mac came out of there, and then that definitely ties in with information that's in this film too. And it's crazy. I mean, when you go to Manchester, you had all kinds of people that came out of Manchester, both back in the day and in recent history as well. From the second British invasion that happened in the 90s with Britpop was single-handedly out of Manchester. But even before that, you had bands like the Smiths and Morrissey, and you had the Zombies. You had tons of bands that came out of that area, but ones that even people don't even associate to this day with those areas. And then, where else? There's so many. I can't even remember them all. I couldn't even name them all in the film because there were so many. I had to cut the list short because it's just a who's list that came out of Northern England.
So you mentioned Black Sabbath.
Yeah.
And Ozzy Osbourne. So that leads us into a very interesting character. I believe he was known as the Al Capone of rock and roll at one point. He was
absolutely
the English manager, the father of Ozzy Osbourne's wife, Sharon Osbourne, Don Arden. So tell us about this interesting character, very tough guy, Don Arden, who went on to manage, I believe, at ELO as well. We mentioned Jeff Lynne at ELO and Black Sabbath. Who was Don Arden?
Well, you got one thing correct. He was definitely a character, but a lot of people in even fans, a lot of people don't even know who Don Arden is or was or anything. And but a lot of people know who Peter Grant was, who was Led Zeppelin's manager, because he was one of the guys that was notoriously known for being this, real hard and tough band manager guy. So a lot of people know who he was, but he was actually he was Don Arden's protege. I mean, Peter Grant was Don Arden's protege. He learned everything that he knew about being tough as nails from this guy, Don Arden. And Don Arden was just he was a wannabe. He was really, in his early days, he was a wannabe. He was trying any way he could to get into show business. And he was actually managing country bands and acts like Jerry Lee Lewis and stuff in the 50s in America. And when he couldn't get arrested from in England from his hometown where he came from, of course, Manchester himself, but he rose up by managing the Small Faces, and the Small Faces were his first big act, and he was very protective of them, and they became rather disillusioned pretty quickly with him because, on top of being notoriously hard to deal with, he was also a crook. I mean, let's just get that out there. He was ripping off his artists. He was keeping them plowed with drugs and everything else and groupies. And meanwhile, he was just stealing from them out there. I mean, really, it's almost not a stretch to say that Don Arden single-handedly himself created the, whatever you want to call it, the myth, the lore, whatever. He almost single-handedly created the mantra of sex, drugs, and rock and roll himself. I mean, this guy, he was hugely innovative in what he did in the industry as far as, being able to ensure that his acts weren't going to get ripped off by whoever they were working for, but they were for sure going to get ripped off by him.
Right. But you tell the story in Spellcasters Volume 3 of Don Arden going into one of the record labels. He didn't feel as if they were getting behind a particular album. I don't know if it was a Black Sabbath album or an ELO album, and he was furious with I guess they used to call them the R&R person, for not promoting the album properly. And he went in there and he flipped over the desk and he just put the fear of God in record executives.
Yeah, and it was not just him that they were scared of so much as the connections that he had, because it was well known. Of course, he had the nickname, as you said, of the Don King, the Al Capone of rock, but he really did have connections to organized crime, and that's where we'll be going next here in the conversation, I'm sure. But he really did have connections to the mafia, to those type of people, and he was feared not just because he himself was a crazy person, but he was feared because he had these connections. And Black Sabbath has gone on the record several times and talked about how they were getting this pure uncut cocaine that was coming in from somewhere, and they knew that it was coming from, they just said the manager. They wouldn't say Don Arden. They were so scared. I think even when they said this, and I think he was dead even at that time, that's how much of a shadow that Don Arden cast, as people were still scared to talk about what this guy did even after he was dead and gone, because he was just notorious for being somebody you didn't want to get on the wrong side of. And so Black Sabbath,
a little bit of that rubbed off on his daughter Sharon, as we'll find out a little bit later. But there's another. Just to give people a sense of the man, Don Arden. There's another story you tell in Spellcasters 3, and it has to do with Robert Stigwood, who is I think he was a protege of Brian Epstein.
Yep.
And it, basically, as I understand it, if I'm remembering correctly in the film, Don Arden stole the small faces away from Robert Stigwood and used...
No. Robert Stigwood attempted to steal the small faces away from Don Arden.
That's it.
Continue.
Okay. Well, you tell us, how did Don Arden settle that?
Well, he was, like I said, he was very protective of his artists, and he knew Stigwood had a reputation, and he was already kind of hinky about anything to do with the Beatles, because anytime that he got close to anything that was related to the Beatles, he got screwed over. So as soon as he started to smell that Stigwood was sort of trying to pull the small faces away, he did we know the story. Everybody knows the story about Suge Knight hanging a Vanilla Ice over a balcony in the 1990s. Everybody's heard that story, but 30 years before that, here's Don Arden. He's tying Robert Stigwood to a chair and dangles him over a balcony and tells him if he doesn't stay away from the small faces, next time he's going over. And that shut that down. They couldn't get anybody to sign him. They were trying to get him away from Don Arden because he was ripping them off, and everybody was too scared to sign the small faces because they were so scared of Don Arden.
It really was the Wild West, rock and roll, back then.
It was, man. Totally. And in good and bad ways. I mean, you had the payola stuff. You had all of that. But for some reason, all of that stuff that was happening during that time, whether it's a credit to just the times or the drugs or the mind control or whatever. But for whatever reason, the acts back then were producing music on a level that has never been matched.
Josh Reeves is here. We're talking about his Spellcasters series, Volume 3. How do we screen it? How do we buy a copy?
You got to go to my download store. It's on payloads.com, payloadz.com. You can go to my Josh Reeves, a Global Reality Channel YouTube page if you want, and you can find links to it there. And if you still can't find it and you don't know where to find it, just email me, globalrealityshow@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send you a link to where you can buy the films at. So thank you, Richard, for letting everybody know.
Well, I want people to support your work. You do great work, Josh, and I want my listeners to get behind you and support what you do because it's quality stuff. So we were talking about Don Arden and his bit of a bull in a china shop, and you hinted at this earlier, and this was, I think it was either Tony Iommi or Geezer Butler from Black Sabbath, and when they basically figured out that Don Arden's business wasn't, rock and roll and tours and making albums. It was using the musical act as kind of a front for the cocaine business.
Absolutely, and that was in conjunction with the Mafia. And as I was saying earlier, those guys in Black Sabbath, Tony Iommi, and all those guys started to witness. They started noticing they were getting the purest cocaine you could get. It was completely uncut. And they knew that their manager, Don Arden, was flying it in somewhere, and they would have these little small airplanes that would show up and deliver this stuff. And when about 1978, 79, I think it was, when they decided that, Don Arden decided it wasn't the band. They tried to say that they tried to change the historical records since they happened to say that it was a unanimous band decision. But even the guys in the band said, look, Ozzy wasn't fired because he was, too messed up. We were all as equally messed up as he was. So for us to say that we fired him because he was messed up on drugs and alcohol is just not the case. Don Arden wanted Ozzy fired, and he used the excuse of him being twisted on drugs and all this stuff to bring in let's just call him. I was going to call him by his funny nickname, but I won't. It might make some people mad. But he brought in Ronnie James Dio, the Magic Midget, and he was the guy that they wanted fronting Black Sabbath at that time, because the Mafia interests who were supplying Don Arden with the cocaine that he was using the musical acts as a front for to sell this stuff, they wanted someone who was Italian fronting Black Sabbath. And there's Ronnie James Dio, who's a completely unknown singer, who's in a band called Elf, which wasn't that big at the time. And they got rid of Ozzy, they brought him in, and then Black Sabbath continued. But his daughter, as you mentioned, which everybody knows now is Sharon Osbourne, but back then she was Sharon Arden. And she was trying to follow in her father's footsteps of being a music manager. And she'd been watching him and working with him all these years, and she'd figured out what not to do. And she saw an opportunity with Ozzy, because a lot of people don't know Ozzy actually, that was what was weird about the whole thing of them firing him, because, Don Arden kept him on Jet Records. He actually re-signed Ozzy right when Black Sabbath fired him from the band at his behest, which was so odd. It tells you there was something weird going on when you figure out that Don Arden kept Ozzy on board as a solo artist, but he didn't like what Don was doing with his career, his solo career. He really wasn't doing anything because he was focusing everything on his already established acts like ELO and Black Sabbath and the rest. So Sharon saw an opportunity to take Ozzy in as her first act in her new musical venture that she was going to start to manage bands and stuff like that. So she took Ozzy, she got Ozzy going, helped him get his first band going, and then
it was a bit of a twofer for Sharon too, as I recall again from Spellcasters 3, that she had a falling out with her father. She kind of maybe there was a bit of, she saw this as an opportunity to spite her father at the same time, so she hooked up with Ozzy, or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but
listen, whether she did or she didn't know, Richard, whether she did or she didn't, he took it that way. Yeah. That's the thing to note.
Right. And she gets married to Ozzy, and she manages him and his new solo career. Now, there's also a story in there which obviously, against...
Oh, he was so mad. God darn was so mad. It infuriated him that she took Ozzy away from him and struck out on her own instead of being a part of his already established thing, which is what he wanted. He wanted his daughter working for him, under him, and she didn't want that. She wanted to go out and do her own thing, and that infuriated him. And he, when she went to go visit him, she had just gotten pregnant, but she hadn't told anybody yet, and he sicked his attack dogs on her, and it's his own daughter, and it caused her to miscarriage.
Unbelievable. Now, Sharon Osbourne, again, a little bit like her dad, maybe a lot like her dad.
Oh, yeah.
In the way that she treated Ozzy's sort of sidemen, the musicians that played with him in his new solo career. She wouldn't pay them. She wouldn't give them credit.
Not even for years. I mean, not even for decades after the fact, and not even after spending decades in court because of it. I mean, she wouldn't even give Randy Rhoads' parents, or his mother and his sister, his surviving family members. She never paid. That was the whole thing about it, is that the whole time Randy Rhoads was in the band, I mean, the guy had probably the most, I don't know, I mean, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Kurt Cobain, Buddy Holly. You had a short list of guys who had hugely impactful careers that were only around for a couple of years, and Randy Rhoads was one of them. And he never in his life, while he was alive, saw a dime for his work. And if you pay close attention and listen to the interviews and stuff, a lot of these guys have really been trying to tell us the truth for a long time, but it's been so disjointed that nobody's really put it together. And it took me a long time to piece it all together and put it all together for this. But essentially what happened, you had the first Ozzy solo album, which was called The Blizzard of Oz, was originally called that because that's what Ozzy called his new project. He wanted the new project to be called The Blizzard of Oz. And in fact, on some of those early, the first Ozzy EP that came out before the first album came out, is actually accredited to The Blizzard of Oz. And this was his band that he, in his mind, he felt like was going to be the perfect combination of the exploration of the type of music that he was wanting to do up to that point, aside from Black Sabbath, different from Black Sabbath, even though in the early days they were playing a lot of Black Sabbath stuff as well. But that was something that he was trying to break out and do on his own. But finding these guys was just one of those magical things that happened where these four musicians that got it together in this room made this magical music. But for whatever reason, Sharon just never wants, and still doesn't, wants to pay the guys that played with Ozzy. And there's been plenty of guys, almost all of them, who have had to play with Ozzy and give Ozzy all the songwriting credits and royalties for songs that they wrote. And that's certainly what they did to Randy and then also Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake, who were the bass player and drummer in The Blizzard of Oz. Those guys, up until a few years ago, were still in court trying to fight her just to get paid for the stuff that they did. And, she was so petty in not wanting to pay these guys that she actually took Ozzy's current band members at the time when she did it. They're not in the band anymore, but one was Mike Inez, who was the bass player for Alice in Chains, and I can't remember the drummer's name. He was in Faith No More, but she took those guys in the studio and had them re-record the bass and drum tracks on the first two Ozzy albums just so she did not have to pay Lee Kerslake and Bob Daisley any money for performance royalties on those two albums. For a long time, you couldn't get the original versions of the first two Ozzy albums at all. You can now.
Spiteful. So Randy Rhoads, he's what, 24, 25? He's really a classically trained musician. I think at one point he wanted to leave rock and roll. He got so fed up with it and wanted to teach.
Well, we'll get to that.
We will get to that, yes. Okay. So Randy Rhoads in Black Sabbath, and again, getting the Sharon Osbourne treatment.
Well, I just got confused. But it was a misnomer. You said Randy Rhoads in Black Sabbath. Randy Rhoads actually wasn't in Black Sabbath, but he was in the Blizzard of Oz band.
Yes.
But yeah, that basically what I was getting to is, as we talked about earlier, when you had these small engine planes, and this is something that I uncovered, and this is an even deeper rabbit hole. This is one of those inadvertent rabbit holes. And I know, Richard, you yourself being a researcher has fallen down this kind of thing before, where you're researching one thing and then you inadvertently find something else that's a complete and total rabbit hole in and of itself you had no idea of. And that leads us to Randy Rhoads here, because when Randy Rhoads died, he died in this plane that was known as the Doctor Killer, the Beechcraft Bonanza. And this type of planes were used a lot in cocaine trafficking, and they just so happen to be the same exact type of planes that the guys in Black Sabbath saw when they were seeing the cocaine being smuggled in during their shows and whatnot. And my theory, now I don't know 100% beyond any shadow of a doubt this is absolutely true, but it's speculation based on the evidence that we have. My speculation is that I think that the decision was made by Randy to leave Ozzy because I believe it was a combination of him not getting paid, and also I believe that he saw this cocaine distribution stuff that was going on with Black Sabbath was also going on with Ozzy, because later on we find out this guy that owned this bus company, Jerry Calhoun, and his family, later on in the 90s, his family gets busted with a Willie Nelson bus, and they find out all this methamphetamine and find out there's been this decades-long trafficking operation going on with this specific bus company. And the owner of this bus company, Jerry Calhoun, is the guy that owned the bus that Ozzy and Randy and the band were on when all of this happened. And that's the whole reason why they were in Leesburg, Florida to begin with, was because they were supposedly going there to have the bus repaired. So when they went to have the bus repaired, the bus driver started taking guys up to, see the sights in these little planes, which Jerry Calhoun just happened to own. And then the story we get is that, of course, we know what happened after that. The plane crashes, it clips the bus, everybody on board dies. But the interesting thing that I found about the whole thing was that for some reason, Sharon brought the bus driver's estranged wife to the scene in a car and parked it close to the bus right as this guy was taking Randy and their hairdresser over. And the guy, apparently they found cocaine in the guy's system. He'd probably been up all night driving the bus, coked out. And when he sees this, he gets angry. And Rudy Sarzo, the bass player for Ozzy himself, went on record and said that he saw at the moment before it happened, he could see the guy's face in the plane look like he was angry and he was mad. He could also see Randy and the hairdresser, both Rachel Youngblood, both crying and freaking out, screaming, "No, no, no." And then boom, it happens. And the keyboard player in Ozzy's band as well, he for years has talked about these photos that he has. He has photos of the scene as it happened, and he won't publish them. Supposedly after he dies, they're going to be published. But the FAA investigator on the scene told him point blank that if it makes you feel any better, this was no accident. This was an intentional act. This was murder. And when you find out that these Beechcraft Bonanza airplanes have been involved in so many rock and roll conspiracies, it blew my mind. I couldn't believe it. It was a rabbit hole I was not expecting to find.
Right. Well, just to get back to the Calhoun brothers and the coach driver who was then piloting that Bonanza plane, the inference here is that Sharon Osbourne, knowing that this bus driver and his estranged wife, Calhoun was distraught. I mean, he was
Wait a second. Jerry Calhoun wasn't actually the bus driver. He was the guy. Jerry Calhoun was the guy. Acock. I can't remember the guy's first name. Jerry. I don't know. Was
right.
Jerry,
it was the Calhoun brothers were the twin brothers that were the country music stars. Acock. You're right. He was the bus driver.
Right. Acock was the bus driver. The Calhoun brothers. How they play into all this is because they owned the buses that all the rock bands used, and they also owned these small fleet of these Beechcraft planes, which all of these rock stars have in the fair ship.
So Sharon Osbourne brought Acock's estranged wife to the scene in order to instigate Acock and drive him around the bend so that he would do something stupid. Is that the...
That's the implication. Yeah. I mean, we don't know for sure, but the fact of the matter is that seeing her for whatever reason triggered this guy to want to commit Harry-Carry. And apparently she knew that going in. She knew this guy was mentally unstable. She was trying to find some way. Randy had to be eliminated. Randy, I think, in my opinion, Randy went to them and said, look, either pay me or I'm out of here and I'm going to expose all of you guys for this, because he had also, I didn't put this in the film, but he had also had a threesome with Sharon and Ozzy. And shortly before, this is like a week before the plane crash happened, Rudy Sarzo, we have him on the record. Rudy Sarzo, the bass player for Ozzy, has gone on the record multiple times and said that a week before he died, he saw Randy get punched at the breakfast table by Ozzy. And there was a heated exchange because they wouldn't let him out of his contract. He wanted to be gone. Something happened. And even nobody else in the band even knew what it was. Something happened that triggered Randy to say, I'm out of here. I'm leaving. And nobody could ever figure out what it was. But Rudy Sarzo himself said, look, I don't know what's going on. But something happened that made Randy decide that he wanted to quit the band, quit music altogether, go become a classical music teacher, guitar teacher, and quit rock and roll altogether. And then a week later, this thing happens, and there's mysterious circumstances, and there's circumstances surrounding the guy who owned the bus and owned the mansion where they were staying and all the rest of it. So it just makes sense when you look at the fact that we know that this stuff continued with Ozzy that was already going on with Black Sabbath, and Ozzy was still off the rails completely. I mean, the whole biting the head off the bat thing, they didn't have him with Black Sabbath. That happened with Ozzy. And that's because he was out of his mind on cocaine, because it was just flowing like water. And I think that there may be more cases of this happening than we'll ever know about.
So the owners, the Calhoun brothers, I guess it was Jack and Jerry, they were country music stars or country music artists. I don't know how big they were.
Yeah.
They were twins. It was kind of a novelty act, I guess. They owned this fleet of Beechcraft Bonanza planes, and that was the plane, obviously, that Acock was piloting and when Randy Rhoads was killed in this crash. But it turns out this, when you go back in music history, this Beechcraft Bonanza, I mean, that was the Buddy Holly plane, right?
Absolutely was. I mean, the list just blows me away when you look at how many famous musicians. I mean, Jim Croce, Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, Richie Valens, they were all on board. And the one that for me that gets me the most is the country music star Jim Reeves.
Yes,
because Jim Reeves, was on the record saying that in November of 1963 he saw Lee Harvey Oswald in Jack Ruby's club with Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby introduced him to Lee Harvey Oswald in November of 1963 in Dallas at a show that he was playing at one of Jack Ruby's clubs. And the Warren Commission refused to take his testimony and put it on the record at all. And he was just telling everybody that would listen. And then what happens shortly thereafter? He perishes in one of these same Beechcraft Bonanza planes, and with these weird stories of people saying that there was all these conflicting weird stories saying that something happened with the pilot and Jim Reeves had to take over flying the plane and he couldn't fly it correctly and it crashed. But they also said that there was witnesses that saw this, which I don't know how you could see that with a plane that high up in the air, but that it also took, all this, a huge amount of time to even find the plane and the bodies. I mean, there was something definitely going on there. But what's fascinating about it is these Calhoun brothers. These guys happen to have this fleet of these planes that have been used time and again. And we know that Don Arden was in America in the 1950s. I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that it's possible that the same thing that happened with Randy witnessing the cocaine distribution of these small planes and whatnot, I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to say that it's possible that Buddy Holly met the same fate, because there's a lot of weirdness around that too, with his gun being found with one bullet discharged, but nobody on the plane apparently was shot. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that shows that this conspiracy of this drug smuggling going on and whatnot could be to blame for a lot of these deaths we were told were accidents.
Right, and of course that famous incident, Waylon Jennings, who was touring with was one of the Crickets, I guess, giving up his seat with losing a coin toss to Richie Valens, who quipped, because they were all getting sick on that horrible tour bus. There was no heat on the tour bus, so Buddy Holly decided we're going to fly to the next concert date. And there was only enough seats for, 3 of them. And Richie Valens wins, quote unquote, the coin toss. Waylon Jennings loses. Richie Valens says, "Oh, geez, this is great. I've never won anything in my life." Little did he know, of course. But the Waylon Jennings, interesting. I mean, did he lose that coin toss really, or?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What's going on with Waylon Jennings, do you think?
Well, I mean, I've heard stories for years. My dad was involved in the country music scene and stuff, and he wasn't like an insider or anything, but he knew some guys like Willie Nelson and whatnot. But I'd heard for years stories about Waylon Jennings not being a drinker, but being absolutely into cocaine and whatnot. And those stories went around forever. But what's very interesting that his connections also have come up with. People have said he was connected to the CIA and stuff too. I don't know, but it's pretty obvious that it's at least worth looking at the fact that he could have witnessed something like this, what was going on, because Waylon Jennings has been so connected with cocaine through the years, even with what's now infamous Cocaine Bear, which has been in the media and the news a lot with the movie and whatnot. I mean, he came into possession of that, and there's a whole weird story surrounding that with this guy that was a cocaine dealer and whatnot. That's all in the film. But I wanted to drop an interesting thing that's not in the film about Jerry Calhoun. I didn't really have a place for this piece of information, but it's very telling. It's a bit of circumstantial evidence, but it's just a very telling story I couldn't get in the movie. There was a gentleman who went to this country music conference or fair or something, and the Calhoun brothers were there, and they had a meet and greet, and he went up to Jerry Calhoun and said, "Mr. Calhoun, I just wanted to come say hello to you because I'm a huge Randy Rhoads fan." And this gentleman said, "This is not a guy that was into conspiracies or anything. This was just a guy just going to a country music event." And he was dismayed by the fact that when he said this to Jerry Calhoun, he said Jerry Calhoun turned ghost white, and got completely nervous. Why are you asking me about Randy Rhoads? He just got all jittery and scared and got completely overwhelmed with fear by just this guy mentioning. He said, I'm just a big fan. I mean, I just wanted to come say. And then he starts saying, "Oh, well, I'm a big fan too. All right, this, that, and the other," acting very, very strange as to why this guy was bringing up Randy Rhoads to him, as if he was scared that this guy knew something he was coming to, get retribution for or something. So it's just a very, very interesting thing that this Jerry Calhoun guy was so scared of that. And then he had incidences after that I didn't even get in the film, where he had a guy show up. Jerry Calhoun had a guy show up at his property and start firing off rounds, and said he was going to blow him up with a bomb and all this stuff. It was in the news. You can look it up. You type Jerry Calhoun shooter, you can find these articles about it. And what's strange is that I've gone back and done double checks and follow-ups. They never, ever stated or gave a reason as to why this guy wanted Jerry Calhoun dead. And it was obvious for some reason that they did not want to make apparent to the public. So this guy and this whole family, the Calhoun family, who I documented in the film, they definitely are players in all of this and are players in this, drug smuggling operation using bands and musicians as a front.
Well, you'll never listen to rock and roll the same way again after you watch the Spellcasters trilogy, especially Volume 3. Josh.
Yeah, I apologize for that. I'm sorry.
No. No, it's the intrigue is amazing. I mean, I didn't mean that in a.
No, I know. I'm just saying it does it to me too. It does it to me too. Sometimes it's hard for me to listen to certain things now because I'm like, I can't get past it. It's very strange. Not in all cases, but definitely there's some where I'm like, if I hear Paul McCartney, I'm like, I don't even want to hear that. Next.
Yeah, it's all part of the rock and roll lore and all documented so well in the Spellcasters Volumes 1, 2, and 3. Josh, thank you so much as always. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate you having me, man.
A new Richard Syrett'S Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.